Have you ever wondered how something as simple as sunlight became something we're afraid of? At some point, we were told to avoid the sun, cover up, stay indoors, wear stronger sunscreen, and if we did take a supplement, just 600 IU of vitamin D would be enough. But what if that number was never enough to begin with? Let me tell you a story. Years ago, a group of independent researchers took a closer look at the data used to establish the current recommended dietary allowance for vitamin D. They didn't run a brand new experiment. They simply reanalyzed the original numbers that were used to justify the 600 IU recommendation. What they found was startling. Instead of 600 IU per day being sufficient for most people, their recalculations suggested that nearly 9,000 IU per day would be required to ensure adequate blood levels for the majority of the population. Not 800, not 1,000, close to 9,000. To put that into perspective, that's more than 10 times the current baseline recommendation. That doesn't automatically mean everyone should rush out and take that amount, but it does force an uncomfortable question. If the math supports a dramatically higher intake to achieve adequate blood levels, why are we still anchored to a much lower number? Other researchers later confirmed similar findings, using different datasets and similar statistical corrections. The pattern was consistent. The intake required to bring most people into a physiologically sufficient range was far higher than originally assumed. And yet, the official recommendation never changed. That gap between emerging recalculations and unchanged policy is where confusion begins. It's also where critical thinking becomes essential. So today we're going to unpack this. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just logically. What does vitamin D actually do inside the body? How much do we truly need to support optimal function, not just prevent deficiency disease? Why is deficiency so common in modern society? And most importantly, what can you practically do about it in a safe, measurable way? Because this isn't just about bones. Vitamin D, more than a bone vitamin. Most people hear vitamin D and think calcium, maybe osteoporosis, maybe older adults trying to protect against fractures. But vitamin D behaves more like a hormone than a typical vitamin. Your body manufactures it from cholesterol when sunlight hits your skin. It then undergoes activation steps in the liver and kidneys before becoming biologically active. Nearly every cell in your body has a receptor for vitamin D. That means it influences gene expression across multiple systems, turning certain genes on and modulating others down. Your immune system depends on it for proper regulation. Vitamin D helps immune cells distinguish between what is a threat and what is self, playing a role in both antimicrobial defense and autoimmune balance. Your muscles rely on it for strength, coordination, and recovery. Low levels have been associated with increased fall risk and muscle weakness. Your brain uses it for mood regulation and cognitive clarity. Seasonal drops in sunlight, and therefore vitamin D, often parallel seasonal mood changes. Your pancreas depends on it for insulin regulation, influencing glucose metabolism and metabolic stability. Your cells use it in processes tied to growth control and inflammation balance. That's one reason researchers have examined vitamin D status in relation to cancer risk and chronic inflammatory diseases. When levels are low, risks increase. Autoimmune disorders, certain cancers, metabolic dysfunction, mood disturbances, muscle weakness, and frequent infections. That's not speculation. That's physiology. The RDA controversy. So how did we land on 600 IU? The Institute of Medicine established that recommendation based on statistical modeling designed to meet the needs of 97.5% of the population. In theory, that sounds reassuring. It implies a built-in margin of safety. It implies confidence in the data. But here's where things become more complicated. The statistical model used to determine that 600 IU would be adequate appears to have relied on an interpretation error. Independent researchers later revisited the same dataset and applied corrected statistical analysis. What they discovered wasn't a minor adjustment. It was a substantial difference in projected intake requirements. When recalculated correctly, the intake required to ensure that nearly all individuals achieved adequate blood levels was dramatically higher. Instead of 600 IU achieving adequacy for nearly everyone, it likely achieved adequacy for far fewer people than originally claimed. The recalculated intake? Roughly 8,000 to 9,000 IU daily to consistently bring most individuals above minimum target blood levels. Now pause there. That doesn't automatically mean everyone should take 9,000 IU. It means something more important. The buffer between adequate and insufficient may have been much smaller than assumed. If the statistical modeling understated requirements, then millions of people following official guidelines could still be functionally deficient. This is not about conspiracy. It's about methodology. When policy is built on math, the math must be correct. Blood levels. The 20 ng/ml problem. Most labs define sufficiency as 20 ng/ml, but here's the critical distinction that often gets overlooked. Blood levels measure circulating 25-hydroxy-vitamin D. They do not directly measure how much vitamin D is active inside your cells, nor do they measure receptor sensitivity or intracellular utilization. The 20 ng/ml threshold was largely based on preventing overt bone disease, such as rickets or osteomalacia. In other words, it prevents the worst-case deficiency outcomes. But preventing severe deficiency is not the same as optimizing physiological performance. Many researchers argue that 20 ng/ml may prevent catastrophic bone breakdown, but may not optimize immune coordination, metabolic efficiency, muscle performance, or neurological function. A growing body of clinicians suggests that levels between 50 and 80 ng/ml may better reflect functional sufficiency for broader systemic support. Not extreme, not toxic, functional. There is a meaningful difference between bare minimum survival and biological resilience. Vitamin D toxicity, how real is it? This is where fear often enters the conversation. Isn't high-dose vitamin D dangerous? True toxicity is rare and typically associated with prolonged excessive supplementation far beyond physiological ranges, often involving extremely high intakes sustained over time without monitoring. When toxicity does occur, it is usually related to elevated calcium levels in the blood, a condition known as hypercalcemia. But here's what's often missing from the discussion. Vitamin D does not operate alone in the body. Magnesium is required for the enzymatic activation of vitamin D. Without adequate magnesium, vitamin D cannot be properly converted into its active form. Vitamin K2 plays a critical role in directing calcium into bones and teeth, instead of allowing it to accumulate in soft tissues like arteries. Hydration and overall mineral balance influence how calcium is handled. When these cofactors are ignored, imbalance becomes more likely. When they are included and levels are monitored, risk decreases significantly. The indoor society problem. Now let's zoom out. For most of human history, vitamin D came primarily from sunlight, not capsules. Short exposure to midday sun on large areas of skin can generate thousands of IU of vitamin D in a relatively brief period, depending on skin tone, season, latitude, and age. Now think about modern life. We wake up indoors, drive to work indoors, sit under artificial lighting, exercise inside gyms, return home indoors. Layer that with sunscreen use, long sleeves, air-conditioned buildings, and screen-based lifestyles. Add processed foods high in sugar, chronic stress, and excess body fat, which can sequester vitamin D in adipose tissue. And suddenly, deficiency becomes not surprising, but predictable. We've engineered an environment that blocks the very signal our biology evolved to expect. No wonder levels are low. Why it matters more than ever. Low vitamin D has been associated with increased susceptibility to respiratory infections and impaired immune responsiveness. It's been linked to worse outcomes in inflammatory and autoimmune conditions. It influences muscle strength and neuromuscular coordination, critical for aging populations trying to maintain independence. It plays a role in mood regulation and circadian rhythm alignment, especially in darker winter months. It impacts insulin sensitivity and metabolic regulation, tying directly into the growing epidemic of metabolic syndrome. When vitamin D drops, resilience drops. And in a world filled with chronic disease, metabolic dysfunction, and immune stressors, Resilience is everything. So, what should you do? First, test. Don't guess. Ask for a 25-hydroxy vitamin D blood test. Second, interpret wisely. If you're sitting at 20 ml, that may prevent rickets, but it may not represent optimal health. Third, prioritize sunlight when possible. Short, consistent exposure to midday sun on large skin areas without burning can dramatically improve levels. Fourth, supplement strategically when sunlight isn't available. Vitamin D3 is generally preferred over D2. Many adults require significantly more than 600 IU daily to move blood levels meaningfully. The exact amount varies based on body weight, baseline level, absorption, genetics, and sun exposure. And remember the cofactors. Magnesium supports activation. Vitamin K2 supports calcium direction. Water supports mineral balance. The bigger question. When independent researchers identify potential errors in foundational health guidelines, and those errors are not publicly corrected, it's reasonable to ask questions. Not to panic, not to accuse, but to think critically. Health recommendations are shaped by committees, liability concerns, risk avoidance strategies, and institutional inertia. But your biology doesn't operate on committee timelines. Your immune system doesn't care about bureaucratic caution. Your muscles, brain, and metabolism respond to actual physiological levels. The goal isn't rebellion. The goal is alignment with human biology. Imagine two individuals entering winter. One has a vitamin D level of 18 ml. The other maintains 60 ml. Their immune systems are not operating under identical conditions. Their inflammatory baseline is not identical. Their muscle function, mood stability, and metabolic flexibility are not identical. Small numbers create big differences over time. And here's the most empowering part. Vitamin D deficiency is one of the easiest problems to identify and correct. It doesn't require extreme diets. It doesn't require expensive procedures. It requires awareness, testing, sunlight, and strategic supplementation when necessary. We don't need to fear the sun. We need to respect it. We don't need to blindly megadose supplements. We need to measure and adjust intelligently. The conversation isn't about 600 IU versus 9,000 IU. It's about whether your body has enough. Because enough for a chart is not always enough for optimal function. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.